there was a leader in the TM movement who was reading the news to Maharshi as a routine. One day, Maharshi asked him if he believed what was in that particular article that he was reading that day. And he replied, "Oh yes." He says, "That's from a reputable journal." And Maharshi said, "You're brainwashed." And the problem is there's too much brainwashing still within the TM movement, amongst the TMers. I'm very much in the forefront of involved in the TM movement. But I'm not brainwashed because when I see things like the statement that the declaration of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, justifying the destruction of a whole country and millions of people, or the destruction of Libya, or the funneling of troops, of weaponry from through Libya to the so-called moderate rebels in Syria. The ones that cut off people's heads because they don't like their violation of Sharia law, or the notion that the people who've been in charge of the declining economy in America for the last 100 years, or 50 years, or 30 years, however you want to measure it, are somehow still experts in economics, even those who've got a Nobel Prize in economics, who claim that everything's fine in 2006, 2007, before the crash comes. These kind of people, all the government officials and all these cronies, these are power brokers. They're not people who can take care of society. No one can take care of society. And that's a big brainwash right there. Some smart people can improve society through their governmental power. What a stupid thing to think. That's a stupid thing to think. Everything is driven by the individual. And, because we went to government schools the last 100 years, and the teachers become stupider and stupider and more interested in maintaining their jobs than in teaching the kids. And it's always like that with socialism. The first generation of socialism is not too bad because of the fact that there's a tradition in the free market of educating or providing services, medical or educational, of service, because the free market is all about service, because nobody has to participate with anybody else, and therefore the providers have to be service oriented. In the 19th century Britain, in the 1840s, 95% of the people were literate. And it was all through the free market. And so 50% of blacks who had just been freed from slaves as 100% illiterate, were literate by 1905. And it was all on their own dime. It was all involuntary, individual initiative. There was almost no government money involved. So, and it's the same with the growth of wealth in the world. It's always, when there's more government involvement, there's less growth of wealth, there's more waste, there's more corruption. You cannot have sustained corruption when when the people have a choice whether or not to participate in the organization which has corruption in it. And which organization is in competition with others that may have less corruption. You cannot have sustained corruption. Rockefeller owned 90% of the kerosene market. He captured 90% of the kerosene. He didn't own it. He captured it. But he had to compete with 50 small competitors. And he lost market share because nobody knows what's going to happen with technology. Nobody knows. A few people will have insights into a few things. That's all. And those people will be the ones that become rich until somebody else replaces them. It's always like that. Microsoft was harassed in the 90s by the Clinton Justice Department. But they lost market share. Like they lost 90% of their market share to Google, 70% or whatever. I mean, they of course, they have their own networks on the internet. But by that time, it was too late. They're just keeping themselves afloat. They don't sell Windows to personal computers like they used to. And that's the same thing's going to happen to Google. You don't need government because nobody can anticipate what's going to happen in a free market. The government just destroys opportunity after opportunity. That's what happened to that's what happened, for instance, to the space industry. Once the government got into the space industry and they kept any capital from going into the space industry because there was no incentives for it, then you had all that terrible inefficiency of the space industry, of the governmental space industry. Now, with Tesla or Elon Musk, they find that the rocket can be 100 times more efficient, right? But that's going to go on forever. That goes on throughout. All these people, these leftists, they proclaim victories for governmental programs. It's kind of like saying that going to the post office is, one guy told me that one year that the post office was in the green. Well, so what? Compared to what? Where are the alternatives? There's no alternative. You can say, of course it was in the green. Maybe they raised the rates recently. I mean, you're talking a vacuum. You're talking arbitrary. You're talking comparing a coercive setup with an unfathomable opportunity for humanity. That's what you're comparing it to. And it's the same with the environmental movement. The environmental movement is completely confused. I heard a talk the other night. This guy says, we shouldn't put economics before biology, before ecology, in growing food or whatever. But there is no separation between economics and the ecology that humans live in. What a stupid thing to say. This is ignorance. Everything you do in terms of growing food or transporting yourself or warming yourself or sheltering yourself is an economic decision. And it's not altruistic at its foundation. Nothing is altruistic at its foundation. Everything is self-interested. The altruism is part of the self-interest. It's not separate. And ecology is part of one's self-interest. It's not separate. It's not separate from one's financial interests. And besides which, the financial ecology has feedback mechanisms to it. And the centralization, the politicization of finances by central banking is exactly what the ecologists are complaining against, because it destroys the feedback mechanisms of individuals serving their self-interests and thereby serving other people's interests. Because as soon as you have a free society, self-interest and altruism is the same thing. It's only under a political regime, a politicized society like we've always had, probably the least so was maybe in the 1840s or even earlier, when actually the courts actually sided against business in favor of the individual. But about that time, they started getting corrupted by business. But the dynamics of freedom are evolutionary, like the dynamics of biology, because human beings are fundamentally altruistic in their selfishness, in their self-interest. They're not selfish. I mean, Ayn Rand misused that word. She misused the word in a literal sense. She said that just to be provocative. The Virtue of Selfishness was her book. She used the word selfishness just to be provocative, but literally she didn't mean selfishness. She meant self-interested, which is all that there is. All that there is in the universe, according to Maharshi. That's what his lecture on All Love is Directed Towards the Self was saying. Nobody's interested in anybody else. Altruism is in terms of yourself. Even a mother's love, even a hero who sacrifices herself or himself to save others, it's always in terms of your own ego. He didn't use the word ego in that lecture, he used the word self. But ego is contained in the concept of, in the subjectivity of an individual. So nobody understands what it means to be free. It means that you own yourself, and it means that everyone else has to serve you. It means they have to serve your ecology, the biology of your environment. Because, for instance, if you take the instance of the Gulf, Gulf Delta, where the water dies every year because all the nitrates get dumped down the river. That's only because there was no ownership there. There was no fishing rights, and the government interfered with it all. It's just like when they had the railroads owned the property out west because the government land granted them in order to build the railroads. And of course, those railroads all went broke because they weren't a free market railroad. And then the ranchers and the sheep herders and the cow herders hated each other because the sheep herders would destroy the grass for the cows because nobody owned it. Or the bison, because the bison were almost destroyed because nobody owned it. But if the Mississippi Delta fishermen, and the Mississippi in general probably, had fishing rights, and we had a free market in the courts rather than politicized courts, and I mean free market, but I don't just mean a so-called minimalist government that can be fair. There ain't no such thing, because it's a monopoly. How can a monopoly be fair? It's not possible. So those people, or those people that live downstream from that river in Ohio that caught a fire, none of that would happen in a free society. Ecology is anticipated in a free society. In politics, it can't be anticipated because politics has no feedback mechanism. The whole idea of freedom is to create not just freedom per se, but freedom automatically creates self-ownership, which means everybody has to serve everybody else to get what they want from everybody else, which creates a feedback mechanism, which can't exist in government. It cannot exist in government because it's a monopoly. You can't have a feedback mechanism when everything's mandatory, when it's compulsive. So this stupidity of people who think that politics and sentiment and fake altruism, I mean really fake altruism, is going to solve the world's economic and human and ecological problems is you're an idiot. You're an idiot. How have we done so far, huh? We've had strong government now ever since Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. He started in strengthening the government. Lincoln did a big job of that too. And, and then the progressives were there, and then the New Deal people, and then the Great Society people, and then the Clinton people, and the Republicans were also destructive of freedom. But I'm just thinking of terms of the socialist expansions and the Environmental Protection Agency. Didn't that come about in Nixon's era? I don't remember when that came about. But all of them will always fail because they lack a feedback mechanism of individual choice. And by the way, ecology is not trump individual choice. That's another stupid idea. You have to define how much smoke versus how much free air you want, how much clear air you want. You have to decide that as an individual. You have to decide, if you want to, how pure the pollutants, how pure the river that you are near has to be. You can't just, and then that decision based on your private property, on your ownership, on the protection that you've created through insurance, and insurance is the basic mechanism through which groups of people will protect themselves. You have to decide how, what the trade-offs are. And ecology is not a science, so no one can tell anybody else what to do based on a science, right? You can utilize biology and climatology and all those things to some degree, but the best way to tell if something is true or not is it's not so much if it's true, it's what you personally prefer. It's not what science says, it's what the individuals want. It's what the culture wants. It's what human consciousness wants. It's not what the objective science says. That doesn't trump anything. So it's a matter of voluntarism. It's not a matter of coercion based on objective principles that can't that are not, they don't have a basis outside of the individual. Objectivity is nothing but intersubjective agreement. And if you negotiate with people through insurance companies, for instance, or on an individual basis, or through some sort of committees that you create, through friendship, through the incentives in a voluntary society are for those negotiations to work something out that's livable. There is no such thing as tyranny that is protracted in a free society. I mean, some people will be more, what's the word? They'll tolerate abuse longer. I don't know if there's a word for that. They'll tolerate abuse longer than others, but that's nothing compared to the abuse of government. The greatest polluter in the world is government when they go to war, right? Or like, for instance, BP, when they had the oil spill, who was the landlord? Who was setting the rules? It was the government. Who told them to drill in deep water instead of shallow water, which is much easier to plug than deep water after it leaks? It was the government. Who set the rules as to how much pay or how much fines, you know? It's a cronyism is all it is. You get rid of government, and all of a sudden you get real, and you have ownership of everything. You have fishing rights, for instance. All of a sudden you have real incentives to not damage the other person. Government has no incentives not to damage anything. They don't give a damn. They don't pay the taxes. They don't go to death, go to war, and die. They're BSing you. They're telling you that, you know, that you should be a hero and pay your taxes and go to war and die, or to not have automobiles or something because the world's going to die. That's a lot of bullshit. Nobody knows anything about when the world's going to die and when the environment's going to become intolerable. They don't know anything about that. Sure, there's problems. Sure, the ocean pH level in the ocean is dropping. Acid levels rising. There's people trying to fix that, you know. There's techniques to fix that, but you don't know if they're any good unless there's private incentive. But you can't have private incentive as long as the government is telling everybody what the ecology really is. If politics is making the decisions, you don't have any what they call it. You don't have any trade-off, voluntary trade-off. You don't have any choice. And besides which, as you become rich, you know, like the U.S. became rich, although now it's going to become super poor. The U.S. is going to be really poor. We're going to be a third world country within a year or two. Besides which, the richer you get, the more options you have. The technology increases, right? What is it? The whales. Remember the whales? They were fishing out they were whaling, destroying the whales in the 1850s and 40s, and then they came along with oil to get kerosene. They didn't have to fish the whales out. Now the whales, the Japanese are still killing whales, but that's because nobody owns the whales. As soon as somebody owned the whales, no problem. They had fishing rights to the whales. You could own the whales. You could tag them. You could tag, just like you used to have, there's no extinct, the bison are not extinct because somebody owns them. And as far as ecology goes, if you have private places, you're going to have better ecology. You know, the Sierra Club owns some ground in Alabama, and they found some oil on it. So they sent in somebody to harvest the oil, you know, with minimal environmental degradation. And then they used the resources to buy more ground to preserve. The incentives to preserve ground are inherent in humanity. I mean, as I've said before, altruism doesn't come from government. It comes from you. And that's what's beautiful about this community is we recognize that to some degree. But we don't distinguish between a coercive environment and a voluntary one. That's when I went up to the Sondheim Convention Center, and there was this guy named Jim Hightower, and he was railing against the Republicans. Who cares? The Democrats are just as damned evil. And and I said, well, why don't we get rid of the Department of Natural Resources and manage everything at local? He said, oh, no, you can't do that. Why not? No, people don't want to face up to their personal responsibility. They want to be They want Big Brother to take them over, because what have they been doing? They've been putting us in schools like communists for the last 100 years, like little brainwashed communist kids in Russia and Soviet Union. There's not all that much difference. And, well, there's quite a lot of difference. But, I mean, they fought in the 80s. The establishment fought homeschooling. But good old America, we busted through. Now you can homeschool. But doesn't that tell you something? They tell you there's WMDs in Iraq, and then they destroyed Libya, and there's slave markets in Libya now. And then Hillary says, oh, we came, we saw, and we conquered, or something. I mean, she was just... And by the way, all those people that do all this stuff, they should build a gallows, with a capacity of 100 or 1,000 people. Well, maybe fewer, because then we could see each group of people that was being hung. Put a big banner up that says, we withdraw all activities, political and military activities from the Middle East, and please forgive us, and now we're hanging all the perpetrators of these lies and murderous thugs, like Hillary and Bush and Cheney. They should all be hung. So all the intelligence and the feedback mechanism only comes through voluntarism for all systems of consideration. Science, biology, ecology, humanities. All these things require individual initiative and cooperation, voluntary cooperation. As soon as you introduce coercion, you've destroyed the feedback mechanisms of what people really want, which is all that counts. There's no superior altruism. There's no ability whatever for politicians and bureaucrats and professors to improve society through fiat, through the command structure. There's no ability whatever. All the ability is all competence for the individual to make decisions is within the individual. It's not outside the individual. Even as I said, the mentally retarded person is the only one who's competent to make decisions for himself. And so these notions of authoritarianism, of superiority of the people who have gone to university and studied this and that and the other thing to be making decisions for us. It's all based on the nonsensical notion that life is an objective reality, and that subjectivity doesn't really count, or it's subordinate, or it's within a playpen that the authorities set up. It should only take place there. Who are these authorities? They're nobody. They're just crooks. Crooks, every one of them. All right.